I'm Gwyneth Parry. I'm a management consultant on technology aspects, and I've been spending the last couple of years focusing on data. Now, my initial background was more from a mathematical sciences side. So, despite the temptation to go into academia, I got lured into the world of technology. And suddenly when you hear things that become commonplace in conversations about analytics, artificial intelligence, it's hard to resist to not get involved, because it's the old habits coming back and you have an interest automatically in these kind of things. Now, when a colleague suggested that I gave this talk, I thought it was a very good idea initially. I said, oh, that's great, let's do this. And a few minutes later, I thought, well, actually, I'll have to stand up in front of all of you here. And so that would be probably the first time of a mini regret of showing an interest. So that's so hopefully you'll enjoy this today. Open data, I mean, it's quite common now. It's not necessarily a new thing that's suddenly become visible to people. It's used in everyday lives. It comes with many challenges. It brings many opportunities. It also brings a lot of concerns from a kind of wider policy and government perspective as to how you handle this, and if you want to encourage it and also protect it, what kind of policies you'll have to consider. There are a lot of questions around open data. It's most of you, I'll expect, given that the type of conference this is. If you don't use it as part of your daily jobs, you might use it as a bit of a kind of hobby on the side. You know, a lot of people like going to government sites and trying to get some visualizations, kind of get a bit of a grip with things and kind of find some interesting patterns. But even just on your day coming here, you could probably use Citymapper, you probably used Google Maps to get here. It's just ever pervasive. I think when you look at all the different uses that's been given, you can look at it from a perspective of, okay, I'm a big company and I have all this data which I can share, or I'm a small startup and I'm going to benefit of all this data, or I'm a government who thinks that I would really benefit on building policies or giving all this information back to society. Now, I've picked a couple of examples, and some of them might be better known than others, and I think many of them might not be new to you. And one of the ones that's fun is the kind of the NASA one. You have the kind of Landsat Science who's been picked all these pictures, and is basically a provider of data for many things, and you can find it in Amazon Web Services. It's one of the data sets that you can easily get access to, and it provides imagery of the Earth. And it keeps it updated. It takes the images, and almost immediately it's available, and it's updated, and everyone can use it. And it's been there for quite a long time. Now, you'll have things like Global Forest Watch, which will use the data from somewhere like Landsat and build all these wonderful maps of deforestation, the impact of climate change, and all these kind of things will be driving policies, and they will be driving a lot of things, especially in things like in developing countries. You can even plan aiding campaigns. You can do so much with all this information. The one that's more common, and the one I mentioned earlier, is a whole relationship between, say, Transport for London and Citymapper. So Citymapper is the one that everyone uses, everyone's got on their phone, and it's probably one of the most closely followed up startups when you think of the benefits it brings. You can go from A to B, you can, in all different forms, and it gets data from many places. Transport for London is obviously one example. You've got Uber, you've got OpenStreetMaps, you've got Get, you've got all these sources that are feeding to produce Citymapper, and it's across 43 cities. And it's still not really producing revenue. but it hasn't started advertising. But it's just, and it gets so much funding because of the potential that this app has. Now, you could go through many of these. Some of them are more interesting than others. I was surprised to find, for example, The Guardian has a very interesting way of using its data. And some of you might be familiar with it, some not. It's a British newspaper, and it kind of collects and gathers its raw data and makes it available to its partners. So it's not available to everyone, but it makes it available to its partners. And in order for the partners to get that data, they carry some Guardian advertising. And it's been doing that since 2009. And this means all the collection of all these articles since, I think, 1999. And they have, so it's a different way of sharing. You're kind of doing more selective sharing as to how you engage and how you can get that benefit. Another one that's quite interesting is Arup. I don't know if people have heard of it. So that's good. It's one of those very big firms that you might not necessarily see a brand stuck somewhere, but it basically offers engineering, planning, designing services, and does projects worldwide. For people from London, think Crossrail, think the beautiful renovation of King's Cross Station, that's really nice ceiling, that's changed everything, that's Arup. Worldwide, think Sydney Opera House. They're involved in those kind of projects. And what they've been doing is they've been creating their own products to support the services they provide. They have something called Hazard Owl, for example, and it gathers data, or gets public feed, from all the different hazards that are around worldwide. So then it can warn its customers of some incoming danger. So it has that again, a very different relationship. It's using open data quite differently. Another one that's quite fun that I'll pick on, and then I'll move on because this could go on for a while. It's Parkopedia. I don't have a car, but you know, when you go on holidays, you hire a car, you want to find where to park. It's always a nightmare if you don't know the area. But this one, maybe I haven't seen it branded as much, but it's in about 76 countries. And you have all this information about parking spots, parking meters, and it's the biggest collection. And you can just find where to park your car, which is great. But it's doing more than that. It now uses sensors that are put in some cities. For example, if you go to Westminster City, if you're driving around there, they've actually got sensors where they can say whether there's a vehicle in a parking bay, in a standard parking bay, not necessarily one that has within a parking lot. It could be on the street. And they've got so much data that now they're upgrading almost and saying, well, in many places we don't have the infrastructure to put these kind of things in place, put all these sensors. So instead, we're going to predict where there's going to be a parking space in the streets. They've started that in Germany, I believe, and apparently it's 80 to 90% accurate. So they can tell you where they think there's a parking space without any infrastructure there to tell you whether it's there. I'm surprised. I don't know if I'm just easily impressed, but I think it's pretty good going. And as I said, you have so many things here, and you have obviously the financial side. You have a due deal, which gives you a view of a lot of firms, and Funding Circle. Everyone knows about it. It's probably, I think worth about $1 billion or something, and it's just very impressive the power it has. Now, the next thing I'm going to say is going to be something that might sound a bit old, and even when I said it, I probably cringed a bit, because it's the whole concept of data as an asset. I mean, that's been repeated again and again and again and again. And every time there's some kind of hype on data, it always comes back to this statement that we must treat data as an asset. And the reality is that there's a very big gap between saying that and actually doing that. I mean, it's when the whole big data thing came, oh, we've got volumes of data, we have so much power, we can do so much, especially with unstructured data. You know, there's all this potential, there's all these opportunities are coming up. Then you had the, you know, Internet of Things. Again, all these devices interconnecting, generating more and more data. Yes, data is an asset. Then you have the data economy. Oh yes, it's all about who owns the data. It's all about the access. Again, data is an asset. And even in May next year, when when GDPR comes in and hits everyone on how they, you know, how they use their data and how they allow people to have some rights over them. Again, data is an asset. But if you put aside the startups, if you put aside the big tech companies, most firms just have no idea of the data that goes in or out. They don't have that visibility, and they might get a bit excited about any kind of mention of AI, any kind of mention of machine learning. It's an easier concept to sell. But but when you say, well, you cannot really do that without having your house in order. And if you do it, well, you might get some value, but you're not getting really all the value. And by the time you go into conversations of you have to learn how to manage your data, the concept of data as an asset has died because it doesn't sell. That doesn't sell. It's just a concept that is very hard to bring across. It requires a lot of investment. It requires resources. And it's a long game, and people are less willing to do so. If they need to tidy up their house, they'll probably prefer to carry on paying for infrastructure that's obsolete. They'll probably prefer to carry on paying high rates to people, specialists that know certain systems, and so they can integrate their legacy with their new ones. That's how most of the big firms operate. So no matter how much this is called out, it's still a problem. It's still just something that a lot of it's easier for the new companies to do when they've had a clean start. The whole thing of, okay, we can get some more insights from data, and this is why it's such a big thing. I mean, you think of Google, you think of Facebook. They are, you know, the key promoters of producing, well, not creating new products out of the data that they've generated. Just because of that, they have that advantage of, okay, well, I've got so much information. I can now tell you, well, Facebook, I can now tell you who your friend is. You can tag that picture because I've gather all this data, and now I have this whole new capability, and Google can do similar things. It can tell you so much, but the key kind of point usually is about customer engagement. It's when startups are looking at using things like open data, they're improving the customer journey. A lot of the time, that's the easiest thing to tackle. It's you have access to all this information that tells you so much about individuals, their behaviors, how they react to different changes, and that's the competitive advantage. So if you understand what your customers want, how they behave, that's your step forward. That's how you improve the customer journey, and that's how you might get customers of established institutions, because you understand that. Then the other thing that comes out of the whole data thing is, it's probably not so much now, but it will happen eventually. It's the trends that you see across different data sources. So now there's a side of governments, of course, who want to share everything, want to make it all public. You have certain data sets. There isn't so much a sharing of different corporations. There's a bit of a fear, and rightly so. I might lose my competitive advantage if I share my data with a competitor. You know, my trade secrets are here. I cannot lose that. And if the reality is that if you do combine them, you will find patterns that you did not expect. You will find new ways of saving, for savings and making things smoother. It's going to happen, but if you try to draw up a contract on who gets what data, it's an absolute nightmare. And it's always going to be someone thinking that they got the bad, the bad end of the deal. Actually, what I'm giving them is worth more than what I'm receiving. And you probably might go through a stage of having a more discrete way of sharing it. So saying, okay, I'll share this kind of data sets with you. And then it might be a slow progression into finding, well, what's the balance? But I think that's probably something that will happen next. That now it's a bit difficult to do that when no one's quite sure of how to value data. Now, with all the whole thing about how important this is, there have been many attempts to put value on open data, and usually it's driven by government initiatives. So whenever you read documents, you'll see 4 reports that are usually called out. And some are more interesting than others. But one is, I'll just put a couple of them there. There's a couple of quotes. I won't go into so much detail, but the first one was done by the European Commission in 2011. And they looked solely at the public sector. They looked solely at Europe. What they were saying, even that time back, was, okay, it was from a public sector perspective, so we have so much information, the public bodies have so much data that could be shared, and currently what's happening with it, it's mainly used for education, kind of cultural knowledge. Now, they also highlighted that they put actually quite an interesting picture of what if at that point they said, well, if we had easier ways of access, if we improve the infrastructure, what would this mean to the economy of, if we did that for open data? At the time, they aggregated all those direct and indirect benefits, and they came up with a figure of 200 billion euros in 2008. So there has been a lot of work done on trying to say, well, how much this could give our economy. Each report does something similar. They have a different angle. For example, the Shakespeare report looks solely at the UK, and again, it's public sector. But they come up with recommendations, and they have the concept of saying, let's have a national data strategy, because we will need this to change how data is managed. And they are working from the concept that, okay, the data that the government has actually is data given by the individual citizen. And all this processing and everything, it's paid by the individual citizen. Therefore, they should own it, and we should give it all back. So that's meant to be the thought process behind it. But they also talk about how it's going to be regulated, how it is going to be controlled. How do you allow people to keep rights over their data versus how do you make that open and accessible for others to benefit from it? And they also speak about having this mixed economy, public versus commercial. So if you have, if you combine the data of both the commercial side and the public side, then you might benefit more from it, and it's just trying to encourage the development of that kind of economy. McKinsey report is actually it gives you quite fun facts. So it gives you something like, well, you can actually say something like 35 hours in your year for commuters just by kind of improving the way you travel based on the information from open data. So and it gives you things like, okay, well, about like 100,000 apps on health and fitness available for smartphones. It gives you all these things, but what it does is quite interesting. It cuts the the global open data economy into different sectors. It does education, it does oil and gas, it does commercial goods, but it spots patterns across all of those and says, well, what are the actually generators of value across all those sectors? And it says, well, the first thing, which it won't be a surprise, is the whole segmentation. So where the value is derived, it's when you segment information and then you identify the variables, and that's where all the analytics kind of comes into place. That's the value of all this, and probably a lot of people in this conference is that side. The value that's gained from the everyday person, a consumer, is more about making informed decisions. You just have access to all this information, and by having access, that then in some shape or form you're kind of helping the economy. The other point it raised was, again, the risk of how is an inherent risk of how do you protect data again afterwards, which is a theme that, again, that comes up, that repeats itself. Now, within the UK itself, I think there's probably one of the first ones to start thinking about policies around how you manage data. I think it was in the mid-2000s. And then it was closely followed by the US, actually. I think he was using Obama's first day in office, that he actually mandated, that open data, we should just focus more on open data. I think the UK and the US are still pretty high up on that things, but you have countries like Mexico, Singapore, they're all very much on this. So you have about 40 countries which have this kind of platforms where they have all their data, all the government data. I think the US data.gov alone has about 90,000 data sets. It's a massive source of information. Within Britain, I think a lot of you might have heard of the Open Data Institute. So it's, and I'll say, this slide, it's all them, but I'll just go through it. I think it's quite interesting what they've done. So, I mean, they've been in London, headquartered in London since about 2012. They basically bring people together. It might be to shape policies, it might be to support and engage with startups that use open data. It's a place where a lot of things come together. And they did this research they looked at 270 companies within the UK, which they would classify as an open data company. And that is someone that invests, uses, or produces open data. And surprise, surprise, about half of them are in London. That's not new. But it also shows the age of companies. So I expected them to be newer, but a lot of them are actually more established companies that are using open data. So only about a quarter of them are less than 3 years old. And the level of adoption is actually quite similar across both sides. What was probably more expected is that most of these companies are quite small. There'll be usually less than 10 employees. It's interesting to see how these firms are built up, and it might be just a better way of working with them. But then the other thing that I suppose this is again not a surprise. Most of them will be in information and communication. That will be the industry they will be working on. But what do they actually do? If we classify this as, okay, you either use, you produce, or you invest in open data, then about 63% call themselves processors of open data. And obviously by that graph, you can see, well, firms are not doing just one of those activities, they're doing multiple of them. They're doing them alongside each other. Now, the reason for having such a high thing for process open data, it's just a clear issue that most data scientists would probably encounter. They spend most of their time cleaning data, it's usually the hard bit, the one that you have to allocate more time for. It's always the cleansing of data, the kind of making sure things link to each other, and so many people underestimate that. The amount of that responses to saying to process open data is because accuracy and quality is important, so they will spend that time doing that if they're going to process that, if they're going to do something and get some insight out of that information. And after accuracy and quality, I think the other ones, a lot of people are very fond of want to check the licensing agreements and see, okay, this data is open and available for me, but what are the terms and conditions? And that's another key driver. Another one was timeliness. Timeliness, of course, if you want real life updates, obviously that's understandable, but it's more than that. If you say are going to set up a business and you say, well, I need real-time updates coming through every day for my new app to work, I have to know that in a year's time, that source is not going to shut down and it's no longer going to stop providing me those live updates. So it's the provenance and the timeliness are key drivers on whether people use that source of data. It's probably quite a normal thing for them to consider. Now, the other bit was large corporations. So we said here you have the small ones, you have the big ones, and I think when we talk about the big firms, if we think of, the bits with the logos there, the very big ones, the highly recognizable ones, those are just a certain type of large corporations. Those are the ones that innovative ones, the ones that are recently quite savvy with their tech, and they know how to make the most of the data they've got. And you have at the very end of the spectrum the ones that I was talking about, like they don't know even what information they've got and they can't trust the information they have and they won't invest to change that. Now, the impact of all this on large companies, it's depending, well, if you're on the kind of very tech-savvy side, it's all wonderful. You already have so much information. You have so much information that you have eyes and ears everywhere. So not only are you creating and developing all these products, but you can actually see when this little startup is starting to make progress, and you can say, well, isn't that convenient? Would this kind of prevent? Would this eventually be a competitor, or maybe I can just copy what they're doing. I can do it faster. I can probably execute it better. I've got the money to do it, or I can outright just buy it. Right? It's being seen quite regularly, actually. So if you think, it's the buying of Facebook, buying kind of Instagram. It's one of those things. You have Microsoft buying LinkedIn. You have the kind of the WhatsApp purchase as well. It's I know small purchases, but that's it, right? You have that freedom. You have that monopoly of saying, well, I've got this power. It's not as if I'm preventing innovation, but I'm just going to make sure I've got all the information, and that's what's happening with them. And it's a vicious circle, because the more data you've got, the more you can generate, and the more you can attract customers. So it kind of gets bigger and bigger, like a bit of a snowball effect. And we do it every day. I mean, well, when Uber was not an issue here. So it's, for example, you'd say, well, I'm not going to use another app because, you know what, it doesn't have as many drivers and the availability is not so great. So I'm going to go for Uber, the one that has more data, the one that has more drivers, and therefore I'm going to give my data to someone that has more data because that's just more convenient, and that's the way it works. So you kind of help the giant grow, and it's just more convenient. We all do it. It's just the way the world works. And then they will restrict how they share that information. They will, some of them actually, they do share information. So obviously Amazon Web Services has this big data set available, and some of it is quite interesting. It has the Landsat stuff that we talked about before. It has like the genome project as well. And it's got something else where you can get all the metadata of songs and things like that. It's all quite fun. But then you have, like, Google provides a lot of data, but again, they choose what to share, right? So you're sharing information on the statistics on the most searched items in Google, or you're sharing, financial information for the past 40 years. You choose what you share, and it's your kind way of giving back, I suppose, but you're not really doing that. And I think even Facebook, you can go use Graph API, and you can get everything down from it, and well, which is labeled not private. So if you didn't figure out your privacy settings, it's not labeled as private. So there you go. So it's you can get all of that, but they choose what to provide. And if you put that and say, okay, these people are just going to take over everything, they're going to control the whole world. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got, well, these people don't even know what data they've got and where it goes, let alone what they're going to do with it. And then you have the ones kind of more in the middle, where you think, okay, I want to be part of this whole thing. I want to understand how things work. I'm going to overlay some analytics on whatever I've got, and I will enrich that incomplete or inaccurate data with open data and try to build a picture and try to work with what I've got. So that's usually how it all lies. And again, the middle ground is probably never going to be able to compete with the big ones, but it's at least trying, and it's not going to lag behind as the other ones are. But the good thing is that obviously this kind of group who's not doing very much for it, that's the window of opportunity for all the small companies. So they will start looking at how they can make the most of the situation. So I'll probably start with a conversation I had with a friend not that long ago. So he was telling me how a few years ago he started working as a contractor. All he had was a 500-pound laptop, and he had, obviously he had knowledge and experience on analytics and AI. He did that for a while, but from kind of an academic perspective. And so he just went and worked as a contractor in one of those very big firms. And you think, well, that's 500 pounds. That's obviously the human capital, I suppose. And then you get an external drive with some data from the client. You just plug it in and use open source software, of course. You don't have to pay for it. 10 years ago, you would have to pay a fortune just to get a license to do anything. And you go, and within a couple of weeks, you can show all these wonderful insights. You use open data to fill the gaps, or kind of put a different layer of information on what you've got, show different angles, and ta-da! You go back, show it to the client, and isn't this wonderful? Look all the decisions we can make based on this information. And the thing is, this is not an unusual story. It's actually quite common. And that's the point. It's pretty common. So many people could do that. There's a lot of people with the skills, with the knowledge to do that. And if they've got the time, they can just do it. So this is an opportunity for people like that. If they've got the time to do that, they can actually look at what's publicly available. And I'm not saying only open data, because you can scrape sites, so it's not necessarily always open data. But you can uncover all the consumer preferences. You can spot all the weird patterns and see how you could fix things. And what's quite fun is also that these people are not only people that have the knowledge on the analytics side, and they don't only have the time to do it, but these people are consumers as well. So, say, I don't like my current bank because they put me on a call center that doesn't know what they're talking about. I'll switch. I don't like the utility firms I'm dealing with. If I know someone else that can provide a better deal, I switch. Now, these people are also consumers. So they've been through that customer journey, and they're looking at things not from the point of view of someone who's producing stuff, but someone who's going through that very annoying experience. And they can say, well, actually, this can work better if we tweak that, or if we change that. So they have that incentive to change things, and they have this almost advantage ahead of producers to say, well, I can see this from a different side. You've been so obsessed with these other things that you haven't actually seen the obvious, and you can start working with it. So every day you see all these new services, all these new ideas coming up, how you can make everyday life easier. And a lot of them are just quite feasible. A lot of them are commercially viable. And that's what's kind of making all this change, and it's having an impact on how things will work in future. And with the government trying to support all these initiatives, so it's everyone for themselves. It's just go, try to see what you can find around. Is experience on an industry so important, or is customer knowledge more important? Or even if you have that experience, is that experience even better than the data about what's happened there? If you've got that data, you don't necessarily need that experience. It might give you a bit of context, but the ease with which you can compete is quite significant. Yes, maybe it's a career change for many of us. I think it will be a good thing for everyone to explore. It's quite fun. Now, I've been given the signal of wrapping up. So, problem is when you like talking and it's something that you think at least is interesting, you go on for a while. So it's so what might happen next? And again, this is just a couple of ideas pointed out. And if people, everyone is going to have a different view on things. So there are lots of things that could change. Personally, I think it's all about data ownership and how that's labeled in future. But it's whether you leave them big monopolies to have that power, whether you encourage the startups, or whether you give more rights to the individual. And it's a matter of whether is a society going to change where the individual actually knows how much value their data has, rather than thinking, I'm just giving my data because it's more convenient and I get all those things. I just click OK because I want to download the app. So it's a mentality shift, and it's also where the government wants to sit with all this. So anyway, if you have any questions or any views, I think I've almost overrun, so yes. Oh. Right.